Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. The Tracks by JesterJames. I'm breaking every single one of my rules for survival doing this, and yet I don't know if I'll die in hunger in a few weeks. Or worse, they'll find me when I'm sleeping and carry me off to where they dwell, nestled in the tunnels beneath the city. I stare into the abyssal depths below me, nothing to make out but the motionless escalator stairs poking their way out of the blackness. I take one last deep breath and savor the clean, crisp February air, and make my way down to find Nate. Nate. He's the greatest survival tool any scav can have. A full-bred German Shepherd who can hear a pin drop a mile away, and he can smell it just as far. I found Nate in an apartment on the 6th day of the crossing, as it was termed by the media at the time. By this time, the portals had opened across the planet in every nation, and all manner of demons began to cross over. I'd hidden in my apartment for as long as I could, but I'd been too scared to leave and stock up on supplies in the first days. I had nothing but a Nutrigrain bar and week old milk lying in the fridge, and I had no choice but to look for food. I searched the apartments around my own, tiptoeing from one to another, almost vomiting at the chaos and gore left in each one, finding little or nothing in the majority of them. Then in number 304, where I had seen a young family with a little girl move in a month before, I found canned food and bottles of spring water. The carpet was soaked in blood, but there were no bodies. I know now where they were brought and what was done to them, and thank God I didn't know at the time, or I would never have left the building. In what I took to be the young girl's room, I heard whimpering coming from a small cabinet beside the bed. As I opened the small sliding door on it, I found a puppy, no more than 10 or 12 weeks old at the time. I immediately fell in love, which is a rare thing when you're standing in an apartment block caked in the remains of its tenants. Ever since then, he's been my closest companion. But no less than 20 minutes ago, one of those demonic fucks grabbed him as I was searching a broken down ambulance near the hospital. I heard a short, painful whimper and rushed out to the street, only to see the gangly, malnourished limbs of one of their stalkers vanish into the entrance of the subway on Grayton Street. They don't kill and eat animals the way they do humans. They use them. They change them into one of their own, I guess, after altering their bodies. Dogs are always favored for their tracking skills, and they've marked the end for many a survivor. That's why I have to find him. If I can't save him, to release him from the torture and cruelty that bondage to these things entails. The further that I travel down, the stronger the smell of rot and decay becomes, leaving a sickly, bitter taste in the back of my throat. In the past, I would have vomited or had to smear Vapo rub on my upper lip to withstand it, but now I've become so accustomed to it, it's like a second nature to me. Every few steps, I find myself standing on the withered remains of those who tried to escape the subway when the portals opened and they crossed over. Those who were trampled beneath the feet of the swarming crowd, escaping through the cracks of a burning building. The bone breaks, cracking beneath my boots every 6 or 7 steps, and I almost stumble downwards on a few. My flashlight only shines 10 or 12 feet ahead of me, and ahead of that, I'm met with solid darkness. It's like this for 10 or 15 minutes until I reach the subway floor. The smell is at its worst down here. and the floors are littered with bones and filth left over by those ungodly creatures further down the tracks. Suddenly an inhuman shriek rings out from somewhere not far off in the darkness, and my heart drops to my stomach like a ton of lead. I turn off my light and go prone on the cold tiles, hearing a thumping against my ribcage and the floor beneath me. I hear a soft pitter-patter running along the ceiling somewhere to my right, and listen as it vanishes down the tracks into the depths, perhaps to alert its demonic brethren further down. I stand up slowly, almost expecting to see the creature jump out of the darkness towards me, but nothing. And after a reassuring deep breath, I make my way to the edge of the tracks and drop down. I twist the top of my cheap steel flashlight, and as the light begins to dim, I make my way down the tracks towards their home, towards what I almost know, certainly, to be my death. The shrieks and hungry growls I hear on the way should be enough to force me to turn around and run as fast as I can, back up the tunnel and back to the surface, but I can't abandon Nate, because he's never abandoned me. He's always been loyal, and I know if I do, the shame and guilt I'll hold will kill me quicker than any demon. After what seems like hours, but it's probably no longer than 20 minutes, I come to a junction in the tracks and a train carriage. Once it was lit up like a Christmas tree, full of commuters going about their day, but now it lies decrepit and lifeless, and whatever may be alive within certainly isn't human. The door of the carriage is torn open and hanging by no more than one, maybe two of its hinges. I make my way past the door and into the carriage, and the first evidence of those things lies in front of me. Hundreds of prints overlapping one another, left in blood from feet and paws, and things that resemble hooves or trotters like those of a pig, but much larger. In some you can make out the long claws and talons used to disembowel and dismember people like myself, people foolish enough to enter their domain. The howls are louder and closer now, and no more than maybe 500 meters in front of me. I don't walk. I crouch down and make my way through the carriage. Small pieces of entrails and viscera lie strewn across the floor of the carriage. I do my best not to stand on them, but I feel the stickiness of the congealed blood and fluids beneath my feet. I can hear them outside the carriages at either side of the crunching bone and soft, wet sound of them devouring flesh. Snorts, growls as they do so. I feel like standing up and running. My whole body and mind are screaming, but as hard as it is, I ignore it and push forward, slowly but surely following in what I can only hope to be the steps of Nate's abductor. I see the end of the carriage in front of me, and once again I go prone and begin crawling towards it, the flashlight slightly illuminating the sides of the door. When I finally make it to it, I'm met with a sight I know will never leave me till the day I die. In front of me, facing away, and crouched over Nate, is the figure of the stalker. The skin of its back, pale and with a sickly green hue, sores and scabs appearing at intervals across it, and its spine jutting out beneath its irregularly long body. Its gangly arms lie by its side, and it reminds me of a ghoulish painting that I'd once seen years before the crossing in a basement close to my old home in Boston, by an artist called Pickman, I think. In front of it, all around, lay numerous piles of bodies and body parts, and atop and between them the demons of all kinds stand, horns and snouts jutting out from between the mess, while others are covered in thick dark fur, slick with the blood of those poor souls brought down here. Near the top of the closest pile, 8 or 9 meters in front of me, A demon lies face down with appendages like those of an insect connected to a body which, although malformed, appears human. But all recognition of humanity fades away as I see the antenna on its head like that of a mantis or a beetle, its head buried in the torso of what looks like the remains of a woman. At first, I think the Nate is dead, but I see the slow and steady rise and fall of his chest. He's alive. Then I realize this is my one and only chance to save him before he's brought deeper into the tunnels towards whatever dark, evil thing waits to change him into a creature like those around me for use in filling this pit with more sustenance for those things. They don't appear to notice the dim light from the torch, and I leave it on the floor beside me, facing the back of the stalker. I slip my hand down my side and into my belt, and I withdraw the military knife from the holster beneath it. I slowly pull myself forward. Every second seems like minutes, and then slowly I swing my legs down from the carriage and find myself outside, my shadow now printed on the back of the stalker in front of me. I know one mistake, one wrong move or step, and I'll alert every single creature around me. I feel the sweat begin to build on my forehead and spend a split second planning my attack. I creep to the side of the creature's back, and as my foot steps forward, simultaneously I bring one arm forward along the side of its head, my hand opened to cover the creature's mouth, as the other stabs upward, the tip of the blade slicing through the floor of its mouth and up into its brain. I feel its lips move beneath my hand as it attempts to let out a cry, but it's too late, and I feel its body go limp and drop to the floor beneath me. The few seconds afterward is the most alert that I've ever been. I wait to hear the howls of revenge from the other demons sealing my fate, but they never come, and they continue to feast, unknowing of what's happened. I slide my hand under Nate and pick him up slowly and carefully, and cradle him between my chest and shoulders and slowly crawl back through the carnage. The journey back through the tunnels is twice as fast as the journey down, and although I'm still aware of the dangers of alerting one of these creatures, I quicken my pace. Before I know it, I'm hoisting myself back onto the platform next to the tracks, and I feel Nate's body begin to twitch and jerk against me. And just as I near the top of the escalators and feel the sunlight from the surface shine on my face, his eyes flicker open, and he licks the side of my cheek.
Posted on No Sleep by Chewingskin. My dog was lost for 3 days. What came back wasn't my dog. As a kid, I was raised in a small fishing community on the eastern side of Canada, surrounded by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the boreal forest. The entirety of the land was close to 4,000 foot square, with an even smaller number of residents sprawled out over the main street, the main road running straight through our little town, and farming houses spread widely between areas that were changed to domestic residential homes when agriculture stopped being profitable. In total, our community is surrounded by a vast expanse of ocean and a seemingly endless supply of trees that spread over 55% of Canada's entire country. I spent most of my life hunting in those woods, so you can imagine my joy when my parents got me a hunting dog. Sandy was a Shetland sheepdog, and while they are more fit to be herding and tracking sheep over grassy plains rather than rabbits and deer through dense forest, it didn't stop me from taking him with me every excursion I possibly could. Sandy had been by my side for enough hunting trips that he'd grown accustomed to waking up just before the break of day, and on a few occasions helped track down small game like squirrels and rabbits through considerably large areas of forest. Sandy wasn't my property, wasn't treated like he belonged to me. Sandy was a member of the family, my best companion, and he was my truest friend. I think fondly back on all the times he'd sit in the front seat of the truck, without being told, ready to go for a walk in whatever part of the forest I took him to. I can honestly say that there will never be a dog that will fill the void Sandy left in my life. I find that dog lovers tend to relate to that sentiment better than others. It was the 30th of October, the first day of deer hunting season. I'd been talking with my family about taking Sandy, my hunting gear, and some essentials to one of the cabins my grandfather owned in his heyday off an unmarked road a few hundred miles into the wilderness for a few days. This was met with a lot of protesting, but nothing was going to stop me from getting in some time looking for wild game in an area that wasn't already picked clean by poachers earlier in the month. Everything was packed into the old blue Ford, Sandy included, and a few hours of driving later we were setting up camp in one of my grandfather's secluded old cabins. Here's where things got fucked up. Oh, Sandy, I am so sorry. I'd spent most of my life being in the wilderness. There were only a handful of times that things had gotten weird for me, but usually everything can be explained with some scientific reason. That's why I brushed off Sandy's weirdness on the first few nights, chalking it up to the nervousness of a dog that's capable of hearing far-off noises of various coyotes, wolves, bears, and moose. This was untouched territory. There'd been plenty of time for the wildlife to set up camp here, too. First night was fairly normal. I had set up Sandy's bed in the corner of the living room next to the TV that looked like it came out of the early 90s. I'd figured I'd give Sandy the option to have someplace to lay down for a while, despite the fact that he slept curled up with me 9 times out of 10. Close to 10 at night, Sandy looked straight at the wooden door and whined. I figured he needed to piss, and I opened the door to let him out, not worried about having my best friend stray too far from me. Instead, he just sat inside the door, looking out at the forest's edge beyond the path. I too stood and looked for a few minutes before deciding he'd just heard an errant critter close to the cabin. The rest of the night was fairly normal, and Sandy slept with me just fine. The second night, I chalked the weirdness up to Sandy's stress. Earlier in the day, we'd been walking a few miles through the woods beyond the house, and I heard the sound of twigs cracking under something heavy. I hoped it wasn't a moose, because my shotgun wouldn't have a chance, but something changed in Sandy that I didn't pay close attention to at the time. He hunched himself on his hind legs, his front pressed close to the ground, his mouth pulled over his teeth, and he growled toward nothingness. I figured we'd try and hunt again later if whatever it was had left, and he should be feeling up to it, but once we were inside, he didn't want to move. Even when I tried to get him to go outside and do his business, he sat at the door and cried, wailing at me to let me know he didn't want to go out there. I didn't pressure him. If he pissed on the floor, so be it, but Sandy never acted like that before. I could excuse an accident or two if he really didn't want to be out there. Must have been a bear, I thought. Before locking the door and calling it a night. The third night is where things went to hell. And I still don't fully understand what happened. The poor guy didn't eat all day. I managed to shoot a rabbit early in the morning when Sandy decided he didn't want to be outside any longer than he had to and retired inside for the day. I cooked it up, threw a little gravy on it, and gave it to my dog. I didn't do this all the time, but I figured now was a special occasion and maybe a treat would put him in a better mood for another walk the next day. He didn't touch it, didn't so much as sniff it. Instead, he sat at my side on the couch, watching the doorway intently. I tucked him under one of my arms, and he laid his head on my lap, eyes still locked on that door. Close to 3 hours of watching grainy VHS tapes on an outdated television set, and Sandy started crying, hugging himself closer to my body. And now this is where my judgment took me down the wrong path for the first time of many. It must sound silly, being my dog's protector rather than the other way around, but this was my family. I figured that if there was something out there that was scaring Sandy so badly, then it was my job to do something about it. So I loaded my 410, opened the door, and stood in the doorway and waited. Must have been waiting at least a half an hour, staring into nothing. There was barely any sound, save for the faint buzz of insects and leaves rustling in the cold autumn wind. Now, moose are not elegant creatures by any means, and if it had been a moose, I would have seen it coming. Heard it, too. Then around the 40-minute mark, Sandy got up and took off like a shot into the darkness of the trees beyond the path, barking wildly. I immediately started to worry, despite my knowledge that my dog isn't entirely helpless in the wilderness. See, there were bigger animals out there that would have liked to take a bite out of him if there wasn't a lot of food around for the winter. Then I heard Sandy's bark fade away in the distance and stop altogether. I waited hours, standing in the doorway with my shotgun cocked and ready to put down whatever it was that was waiting in the woods. I waited hours for Sandy to come back to the house, and then waited still longer till the sun cracked through the trees, and I waited until that night, sitting on my porch step, feigning off sleep deprivation, waiting to see my dog come back. He did come back, but not for another 3 days. Fog had rolled in at that point, and it was getting darker. The night was painting the sky a navy blue. Tracking over the last few days had proved futile, and I started to get worried that I'd need to leave and find more provisions to last me the next few nights. I wouldn't leave Sandy up there lost in the woods, cold and probably hungry. The thought that he would be waiting out there for me to find him and bring him back was distressing enough. I was packing the bag that hung on the coat rack next to the door with what I'd need for the next day's trip. I figured tomorrow would be the last day before I'd go to town, see if my father would help me find Sandy. He was a retired graying man, but I was sure that if I brought up Sandy's name, he'd be more than willing to help me search for him. Thankfully, Sandy came back before I'd even finished the train of thought. I saw him through the window on the path that led down to the main road, a few dozen feet away from the cabin. Normally, I'd hear him scamper up to the doorway and paw at the door a few times, eager to come in, but this was different. I could see the reflection of his eyes as green pearls in the murky fog that had swamped the house. For a moment, I thought it might be an animal, but the outline of his body in the wisps of the thick, low-lying clouds was unmistakable. Still, despite myself, I hesitated. There was something different about his body language. I stared out the window for a few more moments before reason overcame my gut instinct. He could be hurt, I thought, maybe worse. I flung the doorway open, but he didn't come right away. Instead, he stood there, watching me intently. And when he didn't move, I whistled to him. "Here, Sandy," I coaxed him toward the house. "Here, boy." The way he moved was different. It was as though his hips had been dislocated and the angle of his paws changed direction with every step. It's as though he had forgotten how to walk properly. His head was bowed to the ground, but his teeth weren't bared. He didn't seem aggressive. The only way I could describe the look that he gave me was sheepish. Like he had gotten into something that he wasn't supposed to, and I'd yelled at him for it. I thought he might hurt himself hopping up onto the elevated step if he had dislocated his hips, but he did just fine. His back swung a little, oddly enough, and his paws almost folded underneath him, but he didn't go sprawling. He sat on the step and didn't take his look off of me. It wasn't until I'd moved from the doorway completely, opened the door wide and waited for him to walk in, that he moved straight to his bed. He didn't stop at my hand and sniff. He didn't wait for pets or jump up on me like he used to. It was straight to his bed, where he sat and watched me for quite some time afterwards. I returned to the movie at hand, called to him a few more times, but he didn't respond. His ears didn't so much as raise to the sound of my voice or the pat of my hand on the worn-out couch beside me. I'd missed my buddy, but I wasn't about to move him physically towards me. There was something about him that said I shouldn't have let him in, but I just chalked that up to my own silliness, and a few hours later, I went to bed. The more I think back on it, I don't recall him blinking. Not once. He just sat there like a statue, and when I turned off the light, I could still see the reflection of jade green following me as I went into my room and shut the door. I could have sworn I heard him in the night, the sound of nails clicking on the hard wooden floors coming up to my room's door. But they were slow and deliberate. They weren't like a quick bout of Sandy realizing I'd gone to bed and coming to curl up. I heard the noises stop outside of my bedroom, but I didn't hear his whine. I thought nothing of it and just went back to sleep. When I woke up in the morning, I figured it must have been a dream. Sandy was still sitting in the upright position I'd left him when I went to bed. It was as though he didn't move a muscle the entire night, and when I said good morning, he didn't so much as wag his tail. He did follow me into the kitchen, but he paused at the doorway when I put his bowl down on the floor and filled it up with some supermarket dog food. Once again, his back half moved weirdly as he slowly made his way towards me. I had this nagging feeling that something was off about the way he looked that day. It was like he'd gotten longer overnight. Sandy hunched down again, like when he was walking to the door the night before. He didn't come into the kitchen. I figured he must have been hungry out in the wild for so long, but he eyed me like he was waiting for me to come a little closer rather than touch the food. It goes without saying, but after a few moments of a staring contest between me and my unblinking dog, I called that noise off and called his name out loudly. Not even a flinch. I didn't want to move closer to my dog to leave the kitchen door, but this was my Sandy. The most damage he'd ever done was eating flies. Sure enough, as I passed him, he turned and his body swayed unnaturally, but he didn't move toward me. When I left that day, I couldn't find anything. The deer tracks in the mud were made a few days prior and went cold off naturally made animal trails through the woods. I couldn't hear bugs, birds, even the howl of a nearby coyote. Nothing. The only sound from miles away from the campsites were my own breathing and the sound of crunching leaves under my feet. When the sun started to set, I started making my way back, but I should have just packed my shit and left. Just behind a cluster of trees, with the house just visible beyond the rise, I figured I found out the reason why the animals had abandoned this place. Generally, when there are mass animal deaths, that usually means that something is wrong in the area of the slaughter, and the wildlife are usually smart enough to get the hell out of Dodge. Even cats are bred instinctively not to like drinking from water that's close to where their food is, because if you saw a dead animal close to a stream, you'd figure the stream was tainted, find another source of water. In this case, hundreds of squirrels were disemboweled and strewn across the grass in an almost perfect circle. Most of them were skinned alive, but when I turned to heave up all the contents of my stomach, there were a dozen more that were inside out. I couldn't help but vomit repeatedly as I tried my best to walk around the circle of tiny organs and mashed up bodies, not just over the sight, but because the smell was ungodly. I don't know how long they'd been out there, but if I'd stumbled across this sooner, I'd have left with Sandy in tow immediately. Gradually, the bodies stopped and delved off into random dead squirrels here or there, but the biggest thing I managed to find, just a few feet off the unholy feeding ground, was a deer. It looked as though something had decided to skin it alive from groin to neck and then draped some of the skin over a branch like someone was tanning the hide. I don't know how long it had been there, but it smelled like it had been dead for quite some time, despite the fact that there wasn't a single fucking fly. The head had been cut off clean, just above the shoulders, and when I realized the organs had been removed, well, I moved from a walking pace through the forest to a jog. Thankfully, the cabin wasn't too far off. I heaved one final time, wiped my mouth off on the back of my sleeve, and then looked up to the house to see Sandy watching me from the window. I tried to reason with myself and tell myself Sandy's odd behavior could have been trauma response of some sort. I know it's stupid to think of it now, but at the time it was the only reasonable explanation I had to keep myself from going insane. The elongating body could have been just the loneliness getting to me. Sandy had realized that there was something up with this place, and the second he noticed, I should have taken his warning and taken off back into town. Once the door was shut behind me, I started packing the food and essentials back into boxes, moving quickly to try and get my things into the truck before the night came. It'd be dangerous to try and maneuver my way through the trails at night, as the hills off Kelly's Mountain were steep, and in pitch darkness, with my only companion being my headlights, it would have been easy to slide off a ravine and never be heard from again. I didn't want to stay one more night, but I really had no choice. I'd gotten back to the house just moments before the sun finally receded past the horizon, and we were bathed in navy blue sky once again. I didn't pay attention to Sandy. He just sat at his bed and watched me pack. I figured no harm, no foul. I'd throw his stuff in the truck in the morning and we'd be back in town before night the next day. Glancing at him for just a moment, it was a passing thought that he was looking a little longer still that day. And when I went to bed, it was a hard time getting to sleep for the next few hours. Must have been close to 4 or 5 in the morning when I heard it. The sound of whistling. The same whistle that I'd used to call my dog. I broke out into a cold sweat when I realized that whoever slaughtered those squirrels, hung the skin up, left what he didn't need, could very well have broken into my house. The door to my room didn't make a sound as I opened it, slowly, thankfully. I waited a moment, listening to someone call my dog for a few more seconds before I dared poke my head out from the doorframe to get a good look at whoever it was that could have hurt my Sandy. The outside door was open. All I saw was the back half of Sandy, too long and too lanky, almost coiled around the back of the door. His front half was outside. Whatever it was that impersonated my dog was whistling, slowly, and calling for Sandy. I could have sworn that it had hunched down to the ground again and said, "Sandy," in the most ungodly voice I'd ever fucking heard. I closed the door just as softly as I'd opened it. I don't know how long I waited with my back pressed up against the door. I knew that I had left my gun in the bag on the coat rack. I know that I didn't sleep. I waited until I saw the sun break over the horizon, and then I waited some more. Until it must have been midday. Then I finally got the balls to open the door again and make a break for the truck. I was not gonna die in that place. The thing that looked like Sandy was gone and the door was open. His food was untouched, but the fridge was open and, of course, all the meat was gone. I didn't bother packing his stuff. I just threw my bag over my shoulder, made my way to the fort as fast as I could, and turned on the ignition. I can't describe the feeling that overcame me as I realized I would have to leave Sandy in this place. The thought that he could be dead never occurred in my mind. I don't think I could cope with the knowledge that whatever I allowed in my house, whatever disemboweled those animals, could have done the same with him. I made my way down those winding paths and roads as fast as I possibly could without veering off the cliffs. I felt like I was turning in circles down this labyrinth that would take me back to the house, but when I reached the pavement on the stretch of road back to town, I felt relief wash over me, thinking I was safe. But just as I was pulling off onto the cement, I heard something hard hit the back of the windshield, sending broken glass into the passenger seat. I only got a glimpse of the deer's decapitated head, catching on the unbroken glass and tumbling into the back seat. I screamed, of course, and I cried for most of the way home, hands clenched on the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Now, I wish that I could leave this off with a positive note, guys. I wish I could tell you that I found Sandy at home waiting for me. I wish I could tell you this was the end of it, a traumatizing experience in the woods that I'd get over with time. Last night, I found it hard to sleep. I kept replaying the entirety of my trip to Kelly's Mountain in my head. I figured I wouldn't be sleeping for a while, and I just laid there, listening to the wind through my open window. I could have sworn that I heard the whistle I used to call my dog with, coming from the forest's edge. If you go on trips with your dog, I advise you not to let them out of your sight for too long. What comes back might not be your dog.